Got it? Thumbs up. Here's a detailed 1,000-word expansion of part 1 of your story without adding any headings. Dash dash dash. It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the air still carried a coolness that hinted at the last remnants of night. Birds chirped across the manicured lawns of the suburban neighborhood, sprinklers hissed as they sprayed arcs of water over perfectly trimmed grass, and the sun climbed lazily into the sky. Inside his home, Michael Rivers, a former Navy SEAL, had finally found peace. He had purchased this house with his retirement money, hoping to escape the chaos of combat and the endless operations that had defined his life for over a decade. He wasn't a man who sought trouble anymore. He wanted solitude, stability, and the quiet satisfaction of being just another neighbor on the block. But the Homeowners Association didn't see him as just another neighbor. To them, he was a target. Michael had been warned once about violations, things as trivial as the shade of paint on his shutters, or the flag he proudly flew from his porch. He brushed it off, thinking it was nothing more than bureaucratic nonsense from people with too much time on their hands. Yet deep down, he sensed a storm brewing. The HOA in his neighborhood wasn't just a group of overzealous rule enforcers. They acted like a paramilitary outfit, complete with self-appointed officers who strutted around in fake uniforms, carrying radios, writing citations, and intimidating anyone who dared to question their authority. That morning, the storm arrived. It began with a thunderous crash that shattered the tranquility. Michael shot up from his chair, the mug of coffee in his hand spilling across the wooden floor. His instincts, sharp, honed from years of combat, kicked in instantly. The sound hadn't been just a knock or a forced entry, it was the deliberate smash of a battering ram against his front door. Splinters flew across the living room as the frame buckled and the door was torn off its hinges. Voices followed, shouting, aggressive, laced with arrogance. "You're in violation. Step out of the house now." 3 men in tactical vests and black boots stormed inside. They weren't law enforcement, though they dressed the part. Their uniforms bore patches with the HOA insignia crudely stitched on, and they carried themselves with the false bravado of men who had never truly faced danger but desperately wanted to feel powerful. One held a clipboard like it was a badge of authority, another brandished a taser, and the third clutched a baton, tapping it against his palm as if eager to use it. Michael stood frozen for only a moment. His body coiled like a spring, not in fear, but in control. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice calm, steady, dangerous. "You're in violation," the one with the clipboard repeated, his tone almost gleeful. "Your shutters are painted the wrong shade of green, and your flagpole exceeds the height limit by regulation. We gave you warnings. You ignored them. That makes you noncompliant." Michael stared at them, disbelief etched across his face. These men had just destroyed his front door, invaded his home, and were yelling about shutters and a flagpole. "You broke into my house for paint." The man with the baton sneered. "We enforce the rules here. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Something inside Michael snapped. Not out of anger, but out of recognition. He had dealt with warlords, insurgents, and mercenaries overseas, all of them fueled by the same thing these men carried in their eyes: unchecked power. They thrived on intimidation. They believed fear would keep people compliant. What they didn't know was that they had chosen the wrong house, the wrong man, and the wrong past to test their theater of authority. Michael raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in a silent gesture of warning. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You have no authority here. And you just committed a crime." But the HOA cops only laughed. They thought they were in control, that he was just another homeowner too scared to resist. They didn't notice how Michael's eyes had already flicked to the corner table, where his phone sat. They didn't know that a single button on that phone could send a coded message to men who owed their lives to him. Men who had stood beside him in deserts, jungles, and oceans, in places these imposters could never imagine. His SEAL brothers. He pressed the button. Silent. Immediate. The three intruders spread out across his living room, pretending to inspect for further violations, but Michael wasn't paying attention to their charade anymore. His mind was already calculating, planning, waiting. Years of tactical training had taught him patience, and patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. Within minutes, he heard it, the faint hum of engines approaching. A pair of black SUVs rolled slowly down the street, blending in with the calm neighborhood scene until they stopped in front of his house. The HOA officers didn't notice. They were too busy measuring his blinds with a tape measure, scribbling down nonsense on their clipboard. Then the front door, the shattered remains of it, darkened with shadows. Men stepped inside, silent as wolves, moving with precision that only came from years of elite training. They weren't dressed in uniforms, but their presence was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, focused eyes, disciplined movement. Michael's SEAL team. The HOA enforcers froze when they finally realized they weren't alone anymore. One of them stammered, his false bravado collapsing instantly. Who are these guys? Michael didn't move. He simply crossed his arms and let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on the intruders like a vice. One of his teammates, a towering man named Cole, stepped forward. His voice was quiet, steady, the kind that made the air itself still. You just broke into a Navy SEAL's house. The words landed like a hammer. The HOA cops, faces drained of color, their bodies trembling as the reality hit them. This wasn't just some neighbor they could bully. This wasn't just a fine they could enforce. They had invaded the home of a man who had faced death and walked away more times than they could count, a man backed by a team that lived in the shadows of danger. Michael finally spoke again, his voice calm, almost casual. You wanted to enforce rules. Fine. My team and I are going to pay your headquarters a visit. Let's see how you handle a real inspection. The room fell into silence. The HOA cops shifted uncomfortably, their false authority crumbling with every passing second. But it was too late. They had awakened something they couldn't control. And Michael Rivers, the man they thought they could intimidate, was already planning the counterstrike. Would you like me to expand part 2 next? The SEAL team's visit to the HOA headquarters, also in 1,000 words. The pounding on the front door was still ringing in his ears long after the so-called HOA cops had stormed out, leaving splinters and a cracked frame behind. John Reynolds, retired Navy SEAL, stood in his living room with his jaw tight, fists clenched, and his pulse steady in that unnerving way only men trained for war could manage. Most homeowners would have been panicked, fumbling for their phones to call 911 or a lawyer. But John had faced real enemies overseas, terrorists, armed insurgents, warlords, and to him, these wannabe enforcers in matching polos and fake badges were nothing but a clown show that had just stepped far over the line. When the dust settled and the adrenaline cooled, John walked through his home, checking every window, every corner. Years of training had wired him to assess damage, threats, and vulnerabilities. The men hadn't stolen anything, hadn't planted anything obvious. They had just barged in, screamed about violations, waved around papers that didn't even look like real warrants, and left, satisfied with their little display of intimidation. But the broken doorframe was proof enough of criminal trespass. He poured himself a black coffee, sat down at the kitchen island, and pulled out his secure phone. There were numbers he hadn't dialed in months, maybe years, but some bonds never faded. He stared at the screen for a long second, then tapped the first name. It rang twice before a voice on the other end answered. Reynolds, the voice said. Calm, but carrying the weight of memory. Clark. Got a situation. There was silence, then a short chuckle. You never call unless it's real. It's real. Fake cops. Wah muscle. They kicked my door in. I need eyes, ears, and maybe more. Say no more. Sending a team your way. Tonight. John hung up. He didn't need to explain further. The men he served with didn't require context. They knew that if he called, It was serious. They had all walked through fire together, pulled each other out of hell. Now, years later, those bonds were stronger than any contract or HOA covenant. By evening, a matte black SUV rolled up the quiet suburban street and parked 2 houses down. Out stepped 3 men. Broad-shouldered, calm, with the unmistakable gait of operators. Civilians might have thought they were just buddies visiting an old friend. But the way they scanned rooftops, checked sight lines, and assessed escape routes told a different story. John, one of them, greeted with a firm handshake and a grin. Heard some clowns thought they could kick in your door. Guess they don't know who they're dealing with. Not yet, John said, leading them inside. But they will. They sat around the table, spreading out the documents John had managed to grab from the so-called officers. Most of it was junk. Badly photocopied HOA bylaws, scribbled notes, even a piece of paper stamped with something that looked like it came from a novelty store. Clark shook his head. These guys aren't even trying to be professional. They're running a racket. They scare neighbors, act like they've got authority, and collect fines. It's organized extortion with golf shirts. And now, John added, they've made it personal. That was all it took. The air in the room shifted, heavy with the unspoken agreement of men who had once operated behind enemy lines. They weren't just going to file police reports or wait for some county clerk to shuffle papers. They were going to do what they did best: gather intel, strike fast, and dismantle the threat at its source. Over the next 2 hours, they mapped out a plan. One teammate, Ramirez, hacked into public records and pieced together the leadership of the HOA. Another, Davis, drove around the neighborhood, quietly photographing vehicles and noting the patrol routes of the so-called HOA cops. Clark, the strategist, coordinated it all, overlaying the data like it was a mission briefing in a forward operating base. By midnight, they had their target: the HOA headquarters. Not just a clubhouse for meetings, but a building in the center of the neighborhood that the board had converted into their command center. Cameras on the corners. Security lights on motion sensors. A couple of trucks parked outside, belonging to the same men who had smashed John's door. They think they're untouchable, Ramirez said, scrolling through a map on his laptop. But they've got more holes in their security than Swiss cheese. We can be in and out before they know what hit them. John nodded. We're not here to hurt anyone. Just to send a message. Loud enough they'll never forget. The team agreed. They weren't looking for blood. They wanted to dismantle the facade, expose the racket, and strip these bullies of the false authority they hid behind. The weapons they brought weren't guns. They didn't need them. They had flashbangs, signal jammers, lock-picking kits, and a level of discipline no rent-a cop in khakis could ever match. At 2 a.m., they rolled out. 4 men, dressed in dark tactical clothing, moved like shadows down the suburban street. They bypassed the cameras with ease, cut the power to the motion lights, and breached the side entrance without making a sound. Inside, the HQ was nothing more than an office space cluttered with files, laptops, and shelves of binders. But those binders were gold. Folders labeled with residents' names, lists of bogus fines, even records of infractions that had been fabricated to pressure homeowners into paying up. Davis cracked open one laptop and whistled. They've been skimming hundreds of thousands. Fake fees, foreclosure threats, the whole 9 yards. This isn't an HOA, it's a criminal enterprise. John snapped photos of everything, uploading evidence to a secure cloud. They planted tiny cameras in the corners, hidden where no one would think to look, and slipped tracking devices under the trucks outside. Then, for the finishing touch, Ramirez installed a timed script that would shut down every computer in the office the next morning and replace the login screens with a single message. You are in violation. Sincerely, the neighbors. Before leaving, John walked to the center of the office and paused. The same men who had shattered his door believed they owned this neighborhood, that fear made them kings. But as he looked around, he felt the balance shift. They had no idea what storm was coming. The team exfiltrated clean, disappearing into the night just as quietly as they had arrived. Back at John's house, they debriefed over strong coffee. "This is just the start," Clark said. "By tomorrow, they'll know someone's onto them. The question is, how hard do we hit next?" John leaned back, his eyes cold but calm. "We let them come to us. When they do, we'll be ready. And when the neighbors see the truth, this whole operation of theirs will collapse." For the first time since his door was smashed, John allowed himself a small smile. These weren't faceless insurgents in some distant desert. These were bullies in his own backyard, and he had no intention of letting them win. The battle line had been drawn, and the HOA had no idea the war they'd just started. Would you like me to expand part 3 next, another 1,000 words, where the HOA tries to retaliate and the SEAL team escalates their response?